I'm Michelle DiMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Silvia Marsan-Sakly, Fairfield University, one of our own, Associate Professor of the Practice, Islamic World, with a specialization in North Africa. Those of you who follow the museum might remember that Dr. Marsan-Sakly gave a virtual lecture on women's status and the family code in Morocco in connection with another one of our exhibitions in 2021 that was on the work of Moroccan-born photographer Lala Asadi. And she served as the faculty liaison for that exhibition, which is a role that involves advising the museum on ideas for programs, spreading word of exhibitions around campus, and in the case of that exhibition, also putting together a fabulous YouTube playlist of contemporary Moroccan music that you can still listen to from that exhibition's website. So we approached Dr. Marsan-Sakly again last year about serving as faculty liaison again for another show. This is the Gladys Triana Beyond Exile that is on view in the Walsh Gallery. If you have never been, it is in the Quick Center for the Arts, which is that building behind the Dolan School. It's on view there through December 17th, and it focuses on the work of a contemporary Cuban-born but New York-based artist, Gladys Triana. In this case, it was not only Dr. Silvia Marsan-Sakly's expertise as a historian of state colonialism that we were interested in bringing on board in coming up with programming, but also her additional personal perspective as the child of Cuban refugees and someone who was herself born in Cuba, someone who forms part of the Cuban diaspora, which extends far more widely than its more familiar conservative bastion in southern Florida. After graduating with a BA in Behavioral Sciences from the University of Chicago, Dr. Marsan-Sakly joined the U.S. Peace Corps. She served 3 years in Tunisia, igniting a lifelong passion for the peoples, cultures, and history of North Africa, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. She earned her master's from New York University in Near East Studies and Journalism, and then a PhD from the same institution in the joint program of Middle East and Islamic Studies and European History, focusing on state colonialism, society relations, and social movements in Tunisia. She has published articles on Libya and the 2011 Tunisian Revolution, and she's currently publishing a book with IB Tauris entitled People, Power, and Protest in Tunisia, 1864 to 2011, for which she received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marsan-Sakly.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to share what is both a part of my life, a huge part of my life, and my professional interests, right? I'm a little nervous, so bear with me, please. All right. So, the title of this talk is Conceived in Revolution, Cuba's Long Freedom Struggle. And it's partly the result of my own inquiry, looking back on my parents' history and where they came from and where I was born. This is kind of our image. So I may ad-lib. I have something written down, but I want to create that connection. So I may ad-lib as I'm going through the PowerPoint. I have a lot of slides. We're going to cover a lot of history, but a lot of personal reflections as well. So this is our image of Cuba in its heyday. Party place, paradise in the tropics, right? It is also, it contains our image of Cuba here in the United States contains as much ideology as we accuse the Cuban government of fomenting itself. Our image of Cuba here, especially post-revolution, is one of, the gulag down south, where people grind under a tyrannical dictatorship that willingly cuts them off from the world market in adherence to a sclerotic, rigid, and illegitimate ideological politics from which millions have fled, including myself and my parents. So these people who have fled, and I'm going to talk about the exile, the condition of the exile. These people who have fled, who live in exile, or are trying to transcend the exile, have chosen or were forced into it, preferring to brave the sharks in the sea rather than living under privation and unfreedom of the island. This is also an image of Cuba that we have as a place that's quaint, dilapidated. This is not as dilapidated as most people kind of imagine it right now, but you can see it from over on the little corner over there. The facade is well painted, but the edges are not. The 1950s, 60s cars that still run through ingenuity. They're stuck in time. So we use black and white imagery to judge Cuba, and specifically also the Cuban Revolution. We, and that includes the Cubans' exiles of which I'm one, only judge Cuba through the prism of its communist socialist ideology that has become state policy. We think of ourselves as free of ideologies, but we are as propagandized as any Cuban living on the island. And we are living and being disciplined under a barrage of constant socialist slogans. I'll tell you why that is, because I returned, right? After 40 years, I returned and saw for myself what my parents fled and confronted the Cuba that is, and my image, my distorted image of Cuba as well. So my question in this presentation is, if you expand the timeline beyond the current government, you can see that what has happened, in a sense, is a logical outcome of Cuba's political and geographical situation along the long history. And I don't say that to support the regime, right, or the government. Some people use regime, some people use government. But what has happened in Cuba since 1959 is not the most violent or repressive in its history. And it is also not the end, because the struggle for popular liberation continues. And so this one, I want to, take you on a little tour of Cuban history. And all right, so we're going to begin. And my students who are in my colonialism class, I see some of you here. This is why I'm fascinated by the New World. Discovery and resistance. On first glimpse of the island, Columbus called it, quote, the most beautiful that eyes have ever seen. As the historian Ada Ferrer writes in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Cuba, An American Story, which I recommend to every single one of you, Cuba was not the first landing of Columbus, despite the fact that we in the U.S. celebrate. The U.S. does not celebrate that holiday. Columbus never set foot on U.S. soil. So it's known for its beauty, but also it is known for its resistance, and that resistance from the very beginning of that contact of so-called discovery. And this is an image of the martyrdom of Taino chief Atuey in 1511 in Cuba. And this was documented by Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, who was an encomendero in Cuba and refused that office when he saw the abuses and the genocidal abuses to which the native population were subject. Before being burned alive by the Spaniards, Chief Atuey, pictured here, of the island of Cuba was asked if he wanted to accept Christianity and go to heaven. Atuey asked if Spaniards go to heaven, to which the priest said they do. Atuey then stated that he'd rather go to hell, where he would not see such cruel people. So I take this as kind of, when we talk about the long freedom struggle, this is exactly what I mean. We're talking 1511, 500 years. In colonization, so you have after the 1500s, colonization and what I'm calling creative destruction, sugar and slavery. After the death of the Taínos and Arawaks, Cuba's first record of slavery was in 1513. And the first large group of slaves kidnapped from Africa to arrive in Cuba was in 1520. Slave trafficking surged during the British occupation of Havana in the 1700s. And then after the Haitian Revolution in 1804, sugar production grew, becoming Cuba's #1 slave-produced crop. One account estimates that between 1821 and 1831, more than 300 slave ships brought an estimated 60,000 slaves to Cuba. Spanish authorities on Cuba made no real effort to stop this. Spain abolished slavery south of the equator in 1820, but in 1886, slavery was finally abolished in Cuba by Spanish royal decree that also made an indentured servitude system known as patronato illegal. So what you're seeing here in this image is it's a punishment of slaves called la escalera, the ladder. And in fact, it doesn't really picture what the escalera means because this was slaves who were flogged to death by being hung upside down in this ladder. And this was one of the punishments for rebellion that Ada Ferrer describes in her book. Enslaved Africans made up to 40% of the population during the first rebellions. And it is said, also this is part of the, one of the images that Gladys Triana has of kind of the abstract image of La Caridad del Cobre, the patron saint of Cuba, who appeared both to Taíno, to a Taíno and to a black slave, signifying the two oppressed populations on the island. Then we're going to talk about Cuba's long freedom struggle, the actual resistance, right? I don't have time to go into a lot of detail. Just know that Cuba, from 1868 to 1878, Cuba waged a 10 years war of independence against Spain. It was the first of 3 liberation wars that Cuba fought against Spain. At the time, the Spaniards represented 8% of the island's population, but appropriated 90% of its wealth. And I want to have you think about that colonialism and capitalism go hand in hand. Therefore, an anti-colonial struggle is necessarily, at some point, an anti-capitalist struggle. And the reason that we cannot see that link, and I struggle with my students all the time when we talk about slavery and the economic basis of slavery and the economic value of slavery versus racism, right, is that, we have a blind spot. We have a blind spot about, the profitability of the slave system that underpinned, and all of that wealth that is accumulated under slavery that underpins capitalist development. So the development of sugar capitalism, racial slavery, colonialism, and military occupation and imperialism are all bound up in the history of Cuba and has a very deep, deep history. And that's just the 19th century. We're not going to even talk about the 20th century yet. So the 10 Years' War, you have a white slave owner, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. I can't go into the whole thing because there's a lot of ins and outs here. A white planter freed his slaves. So the vision was, unlike Haiti in 1804, was to have a freedom movement that included both the white population and the black enslaved population. So as they're trying to gain independence, they're also gaining internal independence from these kind of enforced hierarchical ideologies of that colonialism imposed. The 10 Years' War was a guerrilla war as well. It had very liberal demands. This is where the Cuban national anthem comes from. There was a constitution, but it didn't succeed. 10 years of fighting, and it didn't succeed. And it didn't succeed because the Spaniards successfully manipulated the fear of a race war as a tactic of counterinsurgency, right? Remember that enslaved Africans made up 40% of the population, right? But they knew that the end was near for the slave system. And so the importation of Chinese coolies for cheap labor had started already in 1847. So you have a population in Cuba to this day. In fact, one of my family members is Chinese from that time, whose family emigrated to Cuba from that time. This 10 Years' War was followed by a Little War, which is not really mentioned much, but another kind of struggle to throw off the oppression of being dominated in a colonial system, right? And that didn't succeed. Okay. And then we get to the Cuban War of Independence, 1895 to 1898. And this is the one that does succeed, right? So you had the Cubans fighting from 1895 to 1898, had been fighting a 3-year struggle against the Spanish. They were, as Ada Ferrer also says, within 3 months of beating the Spanish, it was assured that the Spanish were going to be defeated slowly by Cuban effort. But what happens? Sorry, that's not what I want you to see yet. February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine, a ship that had been docked outside of Havana Harbor to ensure the safety of American citizens and interests, because in the 10 Years' War, you had American companies and financiers investing heavily in Cuba. So the USS Maine was a ship that suffered a massive and unexplained explosion. Many historians think it was a false flag operation in which 260 servicemen were killed and 6 more who died shortly thereafter from their injuries. The explosion of the Maine provided the reason for the Americans to intervene in a conflict that Cubans had been fighting for 3 years and were already winning. One of the things that, and I'm using Ada Ferrer again, that she documents quite successfully is the intertwined histories of the United States and Cuba. Cuba was the pearl that United States governments wanted to acquire from the time of Thomas Jefferson. It was almost seen like a gravitational pull that one day this country would belong to the United States, right? And so then the struggle for freedom is also a struggle for freedom from the Spanish, but also not to fall prey to the neighbor of the North, right? So in this logic of geographical positioning, you have all these ties, and she documents really beautifully so many ties, including Cuban women who financed, with their jewels and their donations, the American War of Independence, right? So these are connections that are not immediately discussed very much. So the Americans intervened in 1898, fought for 3 months, and took the credit for winning the war and the peace. So that to this day, that conflict is known as the Spanish-American War, and the Cubans are left out of it. They were not even invited to the Peace of Paris. So as Ada Ferrer writes, American intervention in 1898 was not to help the Cubans achieve victory over Spain. That was forthcoming anyway. American intervention meant precisely to block it. And here we have, and I don't picture him in here, but although he's the father of Cuban, nationalism, the exiled poet Jose Marti rented an office from which he did everything in his power to liberate Cuba from Spain, and at the same time keep it safe from the United States. Marti hoped that real Cuban independence, reinforced by powerful solidarity from the rest of Latin America, could hold the growing imperial might of the United States back. On New York's Fulton Street, there's another connection, where the flag of an independent Cuba first flew atop a pro-annexationist newspaper's offices in 1850, right? After Spain's defeat in 1898, it was not that flag under which the insurgents like Martí had fought and died for decades, that was raised over Cuba, but the Stars and Stripes. So the U.S. occupied Cuba from 1899 to 1903. But before I get into that story, because this really shocked me, right? What I'm going to show you next, when I was doing the research for this talk. So this is one of the counterinsurgency tactics that were used against the Cubans from 1896 to 98. And this was, we think of the concentration camps being first used in the Boer War in South Africa in 1903, but in fact, the first concentration camps were in Cuba, 1896 to 98, to keep the civilians in the countryside from aiding or sheltering guerrilla rebels, known as the Mambises. Spanish Governor Weyler, known as the Butcher, herded civilians into concentration camps. So it was not, the Boers were not the first, it was the Cubans. And so you can see this in a kind of documented postcards, and it says Reconcentrados, Colón Cemetery, Havana, Cuba, and you can see them atop the mountain of bones and skulls. Here's another image. And here you have an official trying to tag the victims, right? And a little snippet from the Baltimore Sun newspaper archives, March 24th, 1898, Horrors of Cuban War. Senator Gallinger describes the misery on the unfortunate island, the victims of starvation. Spaniards admit 225,000 non-combatants have died. The Red Cross Society is said to be in possession of figures showing that 425,000 reconcentrados have perished from lack of food, and that 200,000 more will inevitably die. So there are two things about this. So when I was researching this, yes, there's the documentation, but yet there's also that this is an example of what, sensationalist yellow journalism, right? So people are more concerned with documenting the sensationalist yellow journalism that's going to then spur the Americans to intervene for quote unquote humanitarian reasons, instead of, focusing on this horrible catastrophe, right? Here is this is from the archives, the United States Archives, and this is from 1899. These are children of the reconcentrados, the children who survived, right? And they're using the very racialized term Cuban pickaninnies, right? Okay, here is, so the Spanish-American War, this is from one of these cartoons, right? From the frying pan and into the fire, right? So out of the fire of the Spanish colonialism and into the frying pan of American semi-colony or colonial status, right? And one of the things that came out of this in the agreement of the peace in 1898, as I said, the last 3 months Cubans were already winning. The idea of the USS Maine and the ship exploding and people not, the Americans blamed the Spanish, but there's this big question mark hovering over this, right? Because it provided a reason for intervention. It was also in the mobilization of American soldiers. You had people who had fought in the American Civil War, North and South, who then fought to liberate the Cubans. And so this was a kind of a healing of the wounds of the Civil War. And to a historian of the Middle East, this also reminds me, and I'm jumping out of the timeline a little bit, of the Gulf War and how that is fought to heal the wounds of the Vietnam intervention, right? The Gulf War against Iraq and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. In any case, you have the U.S. occupation of Cuba, 1899 to 1902 results. At the Peace of Paris, like I said, the Cubans are not invited, even though the war was for them. They had been fighting for 3 years, and 10 years earlier. You have increase of U.S. land purchases at bargain prices in Cuba. A lot of latifundia, big farms for sugar plantations were purchased there by American companies. And then you had something called the Platt Amendment, right? And the Platt Amendment was in effect from 1901 to 1934. Remember, Cubans were fighting a war for liberation and to escape, right? Colonial power. This Platt Amendment had a couple of provisions. It granted the U.S. the right to, quote, stabilize Cuba militarily as needed. It committed the U.S. to deploy the Marines to Cuba if Cuban freedom and independence were ever threatened or jeopardized by an external or internal force. So giving the U.S. government the right and the power to intervene. It effectively prohibited Cuba from signing treaties with other nations or contracting a public debt. It also provided, and for a historian of the Middle East, this is especially fascinating and poignant. It also provided for a permanent American naval base in Cuba known as Guantanamo Bay, where today prisoners from U.S. and Middle East wars have been held for 21 years, sometimes without a trial or charge, where you have the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Since the revolution of 1959, the Cuban government has refused to cash the check that leases the base. Here, this is implicitly so as not to recognize the sovereignty, because it's a piece of Cuban land that's on there, right? In which the Americans occupy as if it were leased to them and there's no end date, right? There's no end date. Ferrer writes that many national narratives of triumphant benevolence, like the one in 1898, serve to mask brutality and greed. And so we get to, here's another image here about how 1898 was used in the 1900 presidential campaign, where you have McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. Right? The American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake, right? And so Americans rule Cuba for humanity's sake, right? 1898, also the Spanish-American War, or the Cuban War of Independence, also made the U.S. an empire, right? And here are the fruits of empire, all the territories that the U.S. acquired as a result of winning that war in the Peace of Paris, right? And they're all island fueling stations in the Pacific that were added to the U.S. post-1898, right? So you can see, because the Spanish also had the Philippines, right? Guam, Wake Islands, American Samoa, Palmyra Island, the Hawaiian Islands also. There was an earlier conflict there. But of course you have Cuba and then definitely Puerto Rico, right? Okay. Then we get to revolutionary Cuba. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is an infinitely complex situation that I can't go into in this very limited time. But so I'm going to start with the middle picture. So this is an image of Castro speaking to a group of Cubans. And then, so to get an idea, and I put it 57 to 59 because actually that's what Ferrer also highlights, to make the point that popular struggle was taking place before before the 1959 revolution. People were fighting that struggle for freedom. That ultimately culminated in the 1959 Cuban revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power. And so on the left, this one right here, okay. So this is an image initially from the Bay of Pigs. So these are two incidents that followed immediately from the revolution. So there's a lot of land redistribution, confiscation of US-owned businesses, with the promise of compensation, but nevertheless taking property, right? And there's this question of whether Fidel, I mean, any Cuban probably says Fidel, right? The first name basis, right? Whether he was a communist immediately or whether he was made into a communist by the choices of that, both of the time in the Cold War, but also of the interactions with the neighbor to the north, right? In any case, you have 59, and then you have the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was the failed landing operation in the southwestern coast of Cuba, April 1961, by Cuban exiles covertly trained and financed by the CIA, who opposed Castro's Cuban revolution. Right, so you have a revolution for independence, trying to, Castro would always say, "Esto sí es la revolución," right? This is going to be the revolution that the others were not. We're going to, actually pass measures that are real and tangible, right? Promising that people's revolution, popular social revolution, which many people by 1962 were very disappointed that he didn't deliver. All right, so this Bay of Pigs, 106 people on the invading side died by various means, including execution. The Cubans intercepted. 176 Cuban armed forces were killed in action. Some in the exile community believe that they were betrayed by President Kennedy, who altered the air campaign at the last minute and facilitated the capture of the invading force. The other image here, with the kind of cartoonish image over there, that is an image of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 35 days in October, November 1962, so we're 60 years exactly in that period. Potential nuclear confrontation, right? That remains a defining moment of national security and nuclear war preparation between the United States and Cuba. It is often considered the closest the Cold War ever came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. So and this is especially relevant given what's taking place today with Russia and Ukraine. In response to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, that's the one over here, okay, Cuba requested that the Soviet Union, because by now Castro had declared himself following Marxist-Leninism and his support for an alliance with the Soviet Union. So they asked the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles on the island to deter a future invasion. An agreement was reached between the Soviet leader Khrushchev and Cuban Prime Minister, at that time he was known as Prime Minister, Castro, in July 1962. Construction of the missile launch facility started in the summer, and nuclear missiles were moved into Cuba to secure them from its more powerful neighbor to the north. Kennedy contemplated carrying out airstrikes on Cuban soil to destroy Soviet missile supplies, followed by an invasion of the Cuban mainland, right? Because it was too close. They were threatening, these Soviet missiles were threatening the US border. Such an act would have achieved mutually assured destruction. The crisis was averted only when the US and Khrushchev agreed the US agreed to dismantle the missiles it had placed on Russia-Soviet border with Turkey, right? So there's kind of this, interplay with the border. These secret negotiations. Castro was not privy to that, and in fact was furious when he discovered that agreement. Okay, so this is kind of the revolutionary Cuba. I'm summarizing this very, very briefly. As a result of this revolution, then, you have what I'm calling global Cuba. Cuba, the revolution took place 59, right? In the years 59, 60, 61 is also where you have the decolonial movements in all of Africa, right? African colonies fighting also for their independence, right? And Cuba was instrumental in those decolonization struggles. Cuba's been a major factor in relations among the states of the American hemisphere, but also in Africa. In fact, in 2016, when I was there, I was invited to the University of Havana to celebrate the publication of a book that the person who handles, because in Cuba they're short-staffed, so the person who teaches Middle Eastern studies also teaches African studies. And so he was presenting his book on African liberation, and I'll never forget it. He invited the entire diplomatic corps of African countries who were serving in Cuba, and said, we owe you, Africa, because of the slave population, a great debt, right? And so we contributed to your liberation. It was only what we should have done, right? I had never heard a narrative like that reversed, right? I was really quite moved also by students who were of African countries there at the university in the audience, who put on a performance, right? Who were there on scholarship, right? Students from Africa who were there on scholarship. So Cuba was a critical ally of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and continues to retain close relations with the Russian Federation today. In Africa, from where the ancestors of many Cubans were forcibly abducted via the Middle Passage, Cuba played an important part in decolonization, and in this case, in South Africa, in ending apartheid. Nelson Mandela visited Havana in 1991 to pay tribute to that contribution. The other image here is with Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria after their war of independence against France. So you can see that there. Cuba even had a significant role in the 21st century's endless wars in the Middle East. Like I said before, as the home of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. Cuba's relationship to China has been increasingly crucial since the first of hundreds of thousands of Chinese contract laborers began arriving on the island in 1847. So today, Cuba also has some relations with the European Union. It is currently Cuba's largest export and trade partner and largest foreign investor in the island. Why is that? Because its closest neighbor to the north, the U.S., refuses to trade with it. The U.S. has imposed the longest economic embargo on the island of any of the 60 countries currently under sanction. I downloaded this comes from the Department of the Treasury, and I counted at least 40 countries that are under sanction, if you include Russia and Iran right now. Okay, so the sanctions situation. This is, ironically, one of the regime's excuses for mismanagement and corruption. Undeniable. But the sanctions against Cuba, so I'm calling it to lift or not to lift, right? If you look since 1992, actually, there has been a vote at the UN about lifting or not lifting the sanctions. The latest vote in 2021, 184 countries demanded the end of the U.S. economic blockade on Cuba for the 29th year in a row. The only countries that voted for the sanctions, the remaining were United States and Israel. So you can see the year, who voted in favor, who was opposed, the abstentions, which is, when a government abstains, are they for, are they against? If they were for, they would vote for, right? So it's a kind of an unofficial abstention, right? Opposition. But I want you to see that the countries are consistently U.S., Israel, but also dependent islands like Palau, Marshall Islands, right? Uzbekistan, Albania, Paraguay, Romania is one in 1992. And I wonder, in 2003, when the United States was invading Iraq, because what the vote was. Because the rationale for the sanctions is to increase humanitarian freedom and liberty for people. The U.S. blockade of Cuba, well, here's the irony, that in 2003, what would the vote have been? I tried looking for this, but didn't have time to do that. So Cuba was being sanctioned supposedly for its violations against human rights by a country that was bombing Iraq in a campaign that killed 1 million Iraqis and violated the sovereignty of a country that had not attacked it, right? The U.S. blockade of Cuba in the 60s has been deepened by former U.S. President Donald Trump's 243 coercive measures. The sanctions have made it impossible for Cubans to, one, visit their families in the United States at different times, for remittances to be sent to Cuba. Oh, by the way, there's a joke. There's a joke in Cuba that I heard a lot, and that is, it's about the remittances. But I was told, Cubans live by fe. Fe is the translation of faith, right? Cubans in the island, post-revolution, under a lot of privations, live by fe, faith. But it's an abbreviation for familias en el exterior, right? Remittances from families in the exterior, right? Handouts from the families, right? Because of the sanctions, it's impossible for Cuba to access essential goods and services, including fuel. On top of everything else, Trump designated Cuba as a, quote, state sponsor of terrorism, unquote. Now, to somebody studying the Middle East, where you have groups like ISIS, calling Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism sounds strangely out of place, right? U.S. government claims that the blockade and these core measures are to punish the government, but they, in fact, criminalize the country, and paradoxically also give the government the perfect excuse for mismanagement, el bloqueo. In 2019, Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton gave a speech to the veterans of the Bay of Pigs. He said that the US government would, quote, use every instrument to suffocate tourism to Cuba, unquote. This deprives Cuba of any means to conduct normal trade and commerce, not only with the United States, but also with other countries and firms who are afraid of secondary sanctions, because sanctions is an economic war. During the COVID pandemic, even Biden excluded Cuba from one of his first executive orders, in which he instructed a complete review of the sanctions that hinder the capacity of states to respond to COVID-19. Despite the stranglehold, Cuba managed to independently produce 3 different vaccines, calling them soberanas, sovereign. Even the Congressional Research Service in the United States had to admit that as of early August 2022, quote, Cuba reported over 8,500 deaths since the pandemic began, with one of the lowest mortality rates in the hemisphere, and had fully vaccinated 88% of its population with its own vaccines, unquote. Okay, so then here is the cartoons about the bloqueo, because if you go to Cuba, you'll see this bloqueo all over the place, right? It's an excuse, right? Also, it's real, but it's also an excuse. It serves many different purposes, right? Okay, so now I'm going to switch a little bit to the human toll of this economic strangulation, and that is the condition of exiles, right? And here you have images here of 3 different movements of exiles. The children lining up on the left side, right, are Operation Peter Pan. Operación Pedro Pan was a clandestine exodus of over 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban minors, ages 6 to 18, to the United States from 1960 to 1962. They were sent after parents feared that Fidel Castro and the Communist Party were planning to terminate parental rights and place minors in communist indoctrination centers, commonly referred to as patria potestad. Now, this is a real fear, because the government was, at that time, extremely interventionist into the people's daily life, right? This is one of the reasons my parents emigrated, because my sister who's older, was in danger of being sent to El Campo, right? Away from her parents to do service. And so they weren't having it. They weren't having that kind of intervention into their family, because only parents should say what, how children are raised, and not the government. This program, though, of Peter Pan, consisted of 2 main components: evacuating and airlifting Cuban children to the United States. Miami was a particularly common hub, and there were foster programs set up to care for them once they arrived. Both were led by Father Brian O. Walsh of the Catholic Welfare Bureau. The operation was the largest exodus of unaccompanied minor refugees in the Western Hemisphere at the time. It operated covertly out of fear that it would be viewed as an anti-Castro political enterprise. The other, in the middle, is the Mariel boat lift. It's a processing center, right? That began in April of 1980, when 10,000 Cubans took refuge and demanded asylum in the Peruvian embassy. I have friends who were at that Peruvian embassy who were 15 years old at the time. And it ended with 120,000 Cubans fleeing on Florida's shores and being processed in 1980. You also have to ask yourself, what brought them to flee, right? That is a condition, it's a really harsh economic condition, especially when you compare it to the prosperity of the North, right? The other here were the balseros, 1994, people who risked their life on the open sea in dinghies, hoping to cross safely 90 miles into the U.S. waters. This gave way to this migration policy in the United States called wet foot, dry foot. Rather than placing Cubans intercepted at sea in a camp, the U.S. began sending them back to Cuba. As a result of these migration, there were migration agreements and the introduction of a policy called wet foot, dry foot. That means those who did not reach dry land will return to Cuba unless they feared persecution there, but only those who met the definition of asylum refugee could look forward to eventual resettlement. That wet foot, dry foot was ended in 2017 by Obama. Okay. Then I have a little bit of, this is where the personal part comes in. That's me. Cuban childhood, 1972, dress rehearsal for departure, right? You'll see why I call it that. So this was taken, I believe, a couple of months before I left. And one of the things that impressed me about Gladys's images, how poignantly she captures the mental world of the exile. Because in exile, you are continuously out of place, right? It is a gap that is filled in by memory. In my case, it was other people's memory, right, and not exactly my own. So this was one of the images. I'll show you. I'll tell you why in just a second. Why I put that in there. So I was continuously troubled by feeling out of place, right? And not having a point of origin that I could actually call, where people could have these memories of, because we left, I was born in Cuba and then we left through Spain. So I spent 3 years in Spain and then we moved to the United States. I think Gladys also spent some time in Spain. So for me, it was really important to return. And I did that with a research project in which I'm tracing the Cuban Arab Union and the contribution and links between Arabs and Cubans. And so you have some images in there of what I saw on my trip, my research trip in 2016. That over here is the Palestinian embassy, which Cuba was one of the first ones to open. The Palestinians are stateless people. And Cuba, when the partition vote was taken in the United Nations in 1947 to partition a Jewish state and an Arab state, Cuba was the only country in Latin America that voted no, that this was a great injustice to the Arabs who had already been living there, right? And for that, it paid dearly, right? Here also, as you can see, the Israel vote against, I don't know if that goes back to that, but in any case, the other thing that I saw there was a masjid, or a mosque that was built by the Saudis in 2015. In the third picture there is there were, at the time, restoration projects that were being undertaken. It was Eusebio Leal was the Cuban historian. He passed away in 2020, but if you're going to restore, a lot of the buildings are dilapidated. It's almost a war on architecture, especially that architecture of the colonial period. That's really ornate, a lot of different styles. And so the historian of Cuba was, tried to undertake, especially in that opening period where people were allowed, where Cuba opened up its tourism and people were allowed to go. A lot of restoration projects to this very, very ornate architecture, which is very expensive, and Cuba didn't have the material. Here you have one of these kind of contradictory in the next picture, right? So you have a socialist, Cuban, communist, I would say socialist revolution, right? But so you have this poster, and it's full of posters of this. There's no advertising, which is weird when you land in the island because you're so conditioned to seeing the ads. That's the first thing that struck me, is like, there are no ads here, right? But there were, at the time, these revolutionary, like reminding people of the values of the revolution. But on top of it, you can see there are tourist offices, right? Infotour, and there's like 3 or 4 tourist offices. So there's business, right? And then the other one, I think, is the Teatro Garcia Lorca, which is an example of that very ornate architecture. And that was one of the things that my mother would tell me. She said, Silvia, Cuba's beautiful. Old Havana is beautiful. And I never really believed her, right? Because it was so beautiful, why'd you leave, right? As a child, right, I didn't understand this, and never believed it. And when I went, the architecture is just breathtaking. Then I have family who are still there. And while I was on this research trip, I decided to leave the Paladar, or the hostel where we were staying, and I wanted to see how Cubans live, how ordinary Cubans live. And what you see here are images. Well, this one is from the hotel room, right? Or the hostel, right? So you can see in there those blue things that are hanging on the building, right? You can't really tell right here, but they're water tanks. So Cubans and islands surrounded by water, but you have to collect your water, right? There's a water management situation there. And then this is my cousin, and you can't really see her, but she still lives in Cuba. And I was shocked when I went there to see how she has to manage the water that she collects in those blue big vats, right? So one of the things that she has to do is she has to filter it, boil it and filter it. Why? Because you have this high concentration of this kind of, in French it's calcaire, but deposits, right? So they're constantly having to manage the water, and it comes one day and it doesn't come the other day, and so they have to, they're continuously preoccupied with, getting enough water, right? So this is one of the daily privations of living in the country, and it's not, no one can deny that, right? And what you see here, and this is also to my American eyes, the part of me that's American, right? I looked at her bathroom. I thought, wow, you don't even have a shower, right? And so you have those 2 buckets, and you have the spigot of the water that comes from the big vat. There's no hot water. At least she didn't have hot water. She lives in Havana, right? No hot water, and you kind of use that little cup there to kind of, pour water on yourself as you're bathing. Okay. The other thing that shocked me was shopping, right? Shopping, or the crime of commerce, right? So these are images of, they have a book that rations, right? So you have a basic diet, you're allowed a basic kind of diet. And this is at the vegetable store, and that's one of the typical stores. And this used to be up there, the Woolworth store. So you can see there's one pair of gym shoe there. And people, they've turned it into a kind of restaurant. The picture in the middle was somebody trying to sell baby pigs, right, for food, right? But this was considered commerce. And I ran into a woman while waiting for a bus, and she was selling pasta and was looking over her shoulder constantly to see whether people were, minders from the government were going to catch her in the act of, unregulated commerce, right? And this is the view, the aerial view over here of the market. Again, this is a message also from the market, Feliz Año Nuevo 2016, again with the kind of a revolutionary message there. So this brings me to kind of the end of the presentation, and two images that I think for me encapsulate both, Cuba's experience. I hope, the little snippet of the history that I've tried to sketch out for you. So the image over there, the path to memory, the island, I was really struck by that because it seems like one of those colonial maps of the New World, but also the pieces of the map that keep spiraling throughout the exhibition. And also the other one which is here, and I think this is where Gladys Triana has made an art exhibit or image of a piece of cloth that her grandmother gave her, because you always keep these artifacts, right, from the time period, to kind of bring you back into that memory of, where are your origins, or, where is your place, right? Even if you can't return to the place, or you choose not to return to the place, because I chose to return, but I realized that I don't belong there anymore, right? So that Cuba that my parents had given me wasn't the same. It wasn't. And the interesting thing about it was also when I went into my dad's and my mother's old neighborhood, and I identified myself, this is 45 years later, right? And I identified myself as Carlos's daughter, right? Everybody remembered who he was. So they kept the memory because they don't move very much because there's such a housing crisis. But they really remembered. So they kept the place and the memory there, right? And so what I think, in terms of Cuban exiles and Cuban immigrants, of which I'm one, I would argue for a reconciliation between the two communities, the ones that are here and the ones that have survived over there, or the ones who may continue to be ideologically attached. I'm not sure that, there are a lot of ways of subverting the ideological attachments, as you can see, because people are, selling pigs and whatnot, and, having commerce. And there are ways of, there's dual economies, and it's a very, very complicated system of survival there. But the maps, the memories, and the open directions are about reconciliation, right? And what I wanted to show you here, and why I brought the picture, is I'm going to cry. This is the dress that I wore when I left Cuba, on that plane. And like Gladys in that image, I kept it, right? And it really brings me a sense of place, right? And that's exactly what she's created in there. And it reminded me of when I came to the exhibition and the previous presentation. I thought, oh, this is one thing I can show people: my dress from Cuba, my tie to Cuba. So thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.
You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. At what time were the Russians there? Was that during the Missile Crisis? And do you think
62.
that had an effect on the collaboration of the sanctions on the U.S.?
62.
62.
Mhm.
When did they leave?
Well, they had cooperation up until the fall of all up to 1991, and the special period. So they had cooperation back and forth, and people were exchanging all kinds of programs, like educational programs. I at the University of Havana, I saw people who had studied in Russia, and who spoke Russian, right? So there was actually, yeah, definitely there, the Soviets, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, the Cold War. Yeah. That and the nationalization of businesses, and that impacted not only American businesses, but Cubans who were investing themselves, and there was the first group to migrate were middle class, upper middle class Cubans whose property was being confiscated, and so I can understand the grievances, absolutely. Yes. Oh, there's somebody.
I just wanted to say that we just came back from Cuba a couple of weeks ago, traveled with my family, including 5 young kids, and it is a beautiful, beautiful country, and we were so warmly received.
Yeah, same here. You know what? I grew up thinking, and with that fear, that I can't go back because they're going to call you a worm, right? Gusano, right? And that people were not going to be welcoming, and so there was this fear of, they're not going to receive me. And actually, I've had very open conversations with people. People are not ideologically indoctrinated that they can't see the faults of the system. They absolutely can see the faults of the system, right? But and very open, and with the little that they have, they share it. They share it. Okay, thank you.